This is another important point is you're talking about an experience-orientated approach. It's not some philosophy about emptiness. You're saying, and it's quite uplifting, that if you sit and watch and get some space, you can actually have an encounter with the thoughts, their nature. You don't have to read
Yeah.
these big books about emptiness necessarily, but you can encounter the nature of thoughts. That's the promise here, right?
Well, I sometimes tell the story of the first time I went to see my meditation teacher, who was this old yogi called Thakten Chulek Rinpoche. And the first thing he did was point to the table in front of him and said, "This table, is it empty?" So I said, "Yes." "Do you see it as empty?" "No." "The mind, is it empty?" "Yes." "Do you see it as empty?" "No." "So which is easier? Table is empty, mind is empty." So I said, obviously that the mind is empty. That's much easier to understand. He said, "Okay, then you belong to us."
Yeah.
And I said, "If the table is empty?" He said, "Then I say, go to Sera Monastery down the road."
Yeah.
They are, philosophical debating empty tables. Yogis contemplate empty minds.
Very
And
nice.
that's a difference. Both, if you see an empty table, you understand empty mind. If you see empty mind, you understand empty table. But the path there is different between the yogic path and the scholastic path.
Yes, and different faculties are being used. Like the intellect is being used to understand how the table is empty. So you're drawing on the faculty of intellect, right? Whereas the yogi's paths, as I understand what you're saying, is like a watching, right? And you can watch your thoughts in activity.
Intuitive. It's
Intuitive.
more
Okay.
intuitive.
Mm. Can you say more about the intuitive nature of this approach?
Well, I mean, the point is that, ultimately, we know. Ultimately, we have a wisdom mind. That's the whole point, that we have what is called Buddha nature, that we do have this primordial awareness. That's who we are. But our problem is we don't recognize it, and it's very covered up. It's like I sometimes say, like in India, we have the monsoons, which go on for months, and thick clouds. And so you're always looking at the clouds and you think the clouds are the sky. And then one day the clouds open and there's the blue sky. And you realize that the clouds came from the sky, go back into the sky, but they're not the sky. And so likewise with us, we are so swamped with our thoughts that we can't recognize the awareness, the space behind the thoughts. And that, but sometimes there's a gap. Sometimes there's a moment and a glimpse where we actually see a whole different level of awareness, of consciousness, which is not based on the dualistic subject-object level of the mind. And in that moment, you see it. It's like a whole shift. But then it covers up again because the ego grasps it and says, "Oh, look, now I'm nearly enlightened." And so it's like that deep intuitive nature of our wisdom mind is always there. But what we need is to learn how first to glimpse it and then how to sustain it. The sustaining and the stabilization bit is the hard bit. Glimpsing is not so difficult.
Yes, and people can get hung up on their glimpsing, right? Make it into something.
That's it. And then it becomes another ego thing.
Yeah, this is a problem, actually, it seems.
Yes, it is a problem.
So we're talking about, we talked about the table and also the mind and these different approaches. And a lot of what we've been talking about is the deconstruction of it, the emptiness of these things, and the watching the thoughts vanish. But then you also started talking about, how do I say, like, is insight into the arising, insight into the spontaneous nature, is that also important part of this experience-orientated approach?
Well, I mean, it all goes in stages, you know. I mean, first we learn how to observe the mind. Then we see, I mean, once then of course there is also then when you're observing the mind, there is the thoughts, which are the object, and then the observer, you know, the mindfulness. And then sometimes to drop the object altogether and just be aware of being aware. That is all part of shamatha. But then when we are able to really observe the mind, then comes the question of what is the thoughts? Where do the thoughts come from? Where do they go to? What is a thought? What is a thought? And when one gets sensory perceptions coming from outside, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, what is that? And how does the mind receive that? And I mean, neuroscience has been very helpful in this in many ways, I think, especially for Western meditators, because it's also dealing nowadays, at least, finally, certain neuroscientists at least are dealing with the whole question of consciousness and how we receive sensory perceptions coming from outside and how that's processed by the mind, by the brain, and how consciousness is not the brain, or the brain is not consciousness. I mean, I think this is very helpful for this Vipassana side of it, to start to ask oneself, and who is seeing? Because that's the next big question, you know. Well, all right, I am observing the mind. Who am I? And in this way, going backwards to deeper and deeper levels of awareness, as one after another is kind of, you know, take like an onion. You know, you keep peeling it, expecting you're going to get the core, the stone at the center of the onion, but there is no center of the onion.
Very nice. So are you talking with neuroscientists and some neuroscientists that are not considering consciousness to be a product of the brain? Are you having these
Yeah,
conversations?
yeah,
Wow. That
yeah.
must be very
I
engaging.
was watching a documentary the other day. I could send you.
I'd love to watch it. Yeah.
It was very interesting. It's by this, well, he's an English neuroscientist, but of Indian background. I mean, his name and everything is Indian. So, but he was talking. He works for something in Cambridge or somewhere where now they're really examining consciousness and recognizing that the brain depends on it, but it's not the brain.
Wow.
So this is really very interesting, and how the brain itself. Also, he has an interesting part where he's saying how the brain itself cannot see, the brain itself cannot hear or taste. It only takes in as Buddhism says, you know, it takes in the very dull input, which it gets messages from the eyes and ears, etc., and then makes up this whole program.
Wow.
Based on the past, and then projects that out as our reality.
Wow. So there's some convergence happening now. And because they've done enough almost Vipassana work now.
Well, you know, I think he had obviously studied either Vedanta or Buddhism. He wasn't saying so, of course.
Yeah.
But I mean, a lot of the way he was speaking, it sounded to me like he was also coming from some other deeper tradition. And but it's interesting that that's now the way that neuroscience is going, and the idea being, if it can be, you know, if neuroscientists believe in it, must be true. Which is
the high priests of the West.
But you know, I mean, it can be very helpful to understand that they are also the conclusions they are coming to up to now is very similar to what Asians have known for millennia.
Yes.